Alright, so for anyone who doesn't know, this is actually a part 2 to this chapter review because there just ended up being too much for me to cover in one video, I thought. So for this video specifically, I'm going to be only going over the backstory we got on Buddha, and I know the majority of this chapter was, pretty much just his backstory anyway, but I think what we learned during the fight too was also really important when it came down to explaining not just Buddha's fighting style, but Zero's too. And so I pretty much went in depth in part 1 just to dedicate a full-on discussion to it where I ignored the backstory to talk about it here. So if you want to watch part 1, then I'm going to leave a link to it in the description if you're down to check that out. So as I've said before already in my first part to this review, this chapter was just insanely good. One of the best chapters in the entire manga for me, and I don't think I'm riding on any hype when I say Buddha is now my favorite character. There's just so much that this backstory offers that reminds me a lot about what I especially love about Kojiro and Raiden, two of my favorite characters in the story so far, because they just feel really human. And it's not that I think there needs to be like a reason for me to pity them or even relate to them. I think for me it's more that what Kojiro and Raiden and now Buddha's backstory all have in common is that they really try to answer obviously hard questions that we all think about, and the answers themselves aren't really that complicated. I think except in Buddha's case, it's just really a lot to think about because of how much content there is to it, a lot more than what I think Raiden and Kojiro had. So the beginning of it starts off pretty natural, mainly just introducing the type of society Buddha grew up in, and we're told how he was considered royalty, basically had everything made for him, which ironically would be the things I think Zero would have wanted to give to his own followers, right? Considering he went so far to take in everyone's misery, I think the lifestyle that Buddha lives here is pretty much what we could imagine is the above ideal version of what Zero wanted for his followers. And by above ideal, what I mean is not everyone could be a prince like Buddha grew up as, right? But because Zero didn't even know what he was actually causing by taking in everyone's suffering, I think it's fair to assume if he knew how, then Zero probably would have made everyone royalty, except that's kind of impossible because, then everyone would just be the same. And it's almost like we're being told this for a second time now, that even living in pure materialism where you have the best food, the best clothing, best education, where just everything is purely based on what the world could offer you. If you could just live in a world where everything was handed to you without understanding the meaning of hardship and labor, I think then at some point you reach a threshold where none of it is actually enough, and you give in like how we saw the villagers did in Zero's backstory. But Buddha's backstory takes it even further and shows that he was actually destined, that it was fate for him to rule the world and succeed his father as king. So that's one thing, but another thing is that Buddha never undervalued or depreciated everything he had. We don't see anything about that, and I think this is what separates him from the villagers we saw in Zero's backstory, who just let it consume them, and eventually, for example, they valued their jewelry to the point of fighting over it, or the men who wanted pleasure so much they were with multiple women even. These are just visuals we see shortly, but definitely, they showed signs of no gratitude, of no kindness, no sign of humility, to the point nobody even recognizes Zero. So I think seeing Buddha appreciate and value his life, despite how overly, I guess, glamorous it was, just shows he wasn't your typical human. And the backstory really kicks off when Buddha notices two birds in the sky, one of them killing the other in mid-flight, and this is where he gets his first glimpse of the real world, I think. Like, I know we see him training with the sword, and he does get superior education just for being royalty, but there are moments we see throughout the chapter where he's getting scolded for acting like maybe too relaxed or too casual than he should, since he isn't a common civilian. So by that logic, I would guess he was sheltered by actual violence of the sword, and maybe even real education, the kind that teaches you about science, history, or whatever the case may be, because as a sheltered prince you really only need to know so much. So I would think when he saw those birds fight and one die mid-air, this was the initial moment that made him start to think about his own position in the world, because before he sees it happen, he actually says to one of the birds, "You're not held down by anything, are you?" Implying I think there is a part of Buddha that knows the people around him who tell him how to act and what to say are somewhat just oppressing him, and he feels that, except he's just too good, too grateful, I guess too soft of a person to react. And so when he says that line to the bird, it's almost like we're seeing him get a first example of what true freedom is when one dies, where you have no protection by others because life isn't just handed to you. And when he meets with King Jataka, I think it's where Buddha realizes what he saw happen to the bird is what's happening to his friend. Almost like he's seeing him get smothered by a life very similar to his, but one that could end up being his own for all he knows, where he isn't happy despite how much he offered and sacrificed for his people. And again, a lot of Zero parallels being made here, and why I really just can't help but love Buddha as a character now, because it's tackling a really big question on how to live your life and why, and it's doing it from so many angles that I don't think are even teaching like authentic Buddhism. It's just being done in a way that makes sense. And then suddenly on the way to his funeral, we see Buddha get enlightened, right? And it's kind of weird because it happens just instantly. There is no path to enlightenment. like I thought we would have seen. We even see him get the lotus eyes too though. And I think my favorite part was seeing Buddha throw the flower petals in the air when he finally gets to the funeral, because he isn't mourning Jataka's death like everyone else is. I think I'd say he's celebrating his life. He's showing his honor, not by praying a prayer on how blessed Jataka was, or holding a funeral in a way so that everyone is more impressed with each other than actually mourning Jataka. And so overall, I think a big point here was that everyone except Buddha was honoring him, but they didn't even know him. And it's fair to say Buddha knew him best, because it was Buddha who called him his brother. It was Buddha who showed him love when he came to visit him on his bed, when everyone else just glared at him for acting so improper. And that's because they didn't know Jataka like Buddha did. Buddha actually loved him so much that he didn't even care about his royalty or place in society, while everyone else never bothered to know him because they thought the kingdom and its people were his personality. And it took me a while to understand what Buddha meant when he said he's got happiness right here, and then he points to his heart. But now I think what he meant was that none of their prayers were actually gratifying him, and if he were alive, I think Buddha believes Jataka would have preferred Buddha at his funeral than everyone else. And this isn't because Jataka secretly hates his people or whatever, it's because they remind him of a life that he never got to live. And it could be that Buddha is the most personal he's gotten with anybody. So I think Buddha realizes that and points to his heart when he says he's got happiness in Buddha, because Buddha truly honors him and loves him not as a king, but as a brother, as a human being. And we get an interesting scene later when Buddha feeds a starving man who's actually in the middle of what's like an extreme version of fasting, and Buddha offers him a bowl and tells the priest to shut up. And what I like about this part is we get to see Buddha on the extreme opposite side of the spectrum of royalty, where he's with the poor and starving that are looking for essentially religious refuge, freedom of the spirit really. But he acknowledges that even forcing yourself to suffer is just as ridiculous as living a life that's handed to you. He puts these both on equal terms and weighs them the same. So I think it shows he became wiser and ended up teaching his followers to live morally good lives, live where you honor your friends like brothers and celebrate your lives with each other, but most importantly, doing it because you want to. If you don't want to fast like the old man was doing because what you really want is a bowl of rice, for example, then you should eat from the bowl and make yourself reach what you wanted to do by fasting by other means. And so the backstory ends with Buddha actually interrupting a child sacrifice, and this is where we actually see him lose his temper for the first time ever. He didn't even lose it when he was getting confronted by Loki or Abisu, and he straight up just says he'd be willing to take on the gods on himself if they're trying to force humanity against their will. So that's where we're at now, and this was just an amazing chapter. And I know it's not entirely faithful to actual Buddhism, but I appreciate the storytelling, and you know, now I see Buddha in a totally different light now as a character. Alright guys, so that's gonna be it for me. Let me know how you guys felt about the chapter. Honestly, this was a surprise. I didn't think Buddha was gonna flex this hard, but you know, I'm happy to see it. And again, this is part 2 of the review. If you want to hear my thoughts on the fight, then the link to part 1 is going to be in the description, and I'm going to end it there, guys. If you liked the video, please leave a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts, and if you're interested in more Record of Ragnarok content, please subscribe if you're down. I'll be doing more. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. Have a great day.